And Mr. Horne, you come on.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you. A lawyer, an engineer, and a doctor get into an argument about who belongs to the oldest profession. The doctor says, God made Eve out of a rib of Adam. That was the first surgery, so I belong to the oldest profession. The engineer says, yes, but God made the heavens out of the chaos, so that was a great work of engineering, and engineering is the oldest profession. And the lawyer said, who do you think created the chaos? One of the things I want to do today is I'm touting a book, and it's not my own book. It's called The Conservative Sensibility by George Will. It was just published at the end of last year. And if you start on page 1, you won't be able to stop reading, and I want to talk about some of the ideas in that book, which I liked very much. When we talk about a conservative philosophy, the question is, what are we conserving? The answer is the values of the founders of this country. If you ask most people, what is the definition of democracy, they would say majority rule. But that was not the view of the founders. More important than majority rule is individual liberty. The founders were concerned to avoid tyrannies of all types, including tyranny of the majority. People have natural rights. No majority has the right to interfere with those natural rights. Preserving individual liberty is more important than majority rule. Incidentally, one of the things he pointed out that was interesting is only once, under the original view of the founders in the Constitution, only 1/6 of the federal government was elected. The president was chosen by the Electoral College. The Supreme Court obviously is not elected. And even in Congress, the Senate was elected by the state legislators. So only the House of Representatives was elected by the people, 1/6 of the federal government. The founders wanted to avoid the dangers of tyranny of the majority, and they put in a lot of protections for our individual liberties. Justice Robert Jackson was one of the best writers ever on the U.S. Supreme Court. He once wrote an opinion that the New York Times published in the New York Times Sunday magazine as an article without any changes. His writing was that good compared to most legal writing that I'm sure some of you have seen. Here's one of the important things that Justice Jackson wrote in one of his opinions. The very purpose of a Bill of Rights was to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and to establish them as legal principles to be applied by the courts. Fundamental rights may not be submitted to vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections. George Will presents an interesting distinction between American conservatism and European conservatism. European conservatives historically sought to conserve institutions and practices such as social hierarchies and established churches. Their opponents, who were for individual liberty in Europe, were what we call classical liberals. In the United States, by contrast, it is the conservatives who place the primary emphasis on individual liberty. Liberals or progressives seek to expand state power in order to remake human nature. To progressives, human nature is malleable. To conservatives, human nature is fixed and does not change over time, as is also true of our natural rights. European nations were made by history. America was made by an idea. The idea is in the Declaration of Independence. Each individual has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Government is formed for the purpose of protecting those rights. One of the problems with the progressive philosophy, seeking to use government to change the way people behave, is that government actions often have negative but unforeseen consequences. An example that George Will uses is under the heading of, quote, "It's easy to raise poisonous snakes," close quote. He quotes an economist who decided to get into that profession because he observed government irrationality. He lived in an area where there were too many poisonous snakes. In order to cut back the number, the government put a bounty on dead snakes. The problem with that policy is it's too easy to raise poisonous snakes. People raised poisonous snakes to get the bounty, and the number increased rather than decreased. Another example is government policy to compensate people for having disabilities. When it was compensation to the breadwinner who became disabled, that made some sense. But then it was expanded to children. In an article that I read, a student asked his teacher, "If I do well on this test, will my mother lose her crazy money?" Then they extended it to disability resulting from taking alcohol or drugs. I was in Massachusetts when my college classmate Bill Weld ran against John Kerry for the United States Senate. Weld criticized the policy of compensating people for being alcoholics or drug users. Kerry defended on the grounds that a number of people he knew in Vietnam became alcoholics or drug users. No one has more respect or gratitude to those who risk their lives for our freedom than I do. But I don't think it's a good idea to compensate people for being alcoholics or drug users. Over the past decades, participation in the workforce by able-bodied males has declined drastically. In 1960, 450,000 workers were receiving disability payments. In 2011, it had increased to 8.6 million. 450,000 to 8.6 million, 16 to 1. I'll give you one more example that I dealt with as Attorney General. A federal law requires reasonable accommodations for those who do not speak English. On the face of it, that is reasonable. But here's what happened. A woman walked into an optometrist. This is before I got there. This is under my predecessor. A woman walked into an optometrist not speaking English. The optometrist didn't speak Spanish, so he referred her to another shop that he was associated with where they did speak Spanish. The Civil Rights Section of the Attorney General's office accused him of language discrimination. And he had to fill out endless forms with endless dumb questions that he had to answer. I experienced this when I served on a school board for 24 years, and I would see that somebody would make some allegation, the federal government would send all these forms, and people who should be educating people were wasting their time filling out these dumb federal forms. As you can imagine, when I took office, I changed the policies of the Civil Rights Section. George Will's book also talks extensively about the importance of a market economy. When I was superintendent of schools, I was invited to give a speech to the Heritage Society in Washington to talk about the negative aspects of No Child Left Behind. I touted a book that was current at the time. That's a habit of mine that you might not have noticed, called Lenin's Tomb, which was just published at the time. It was how the attempt to control an economy by centralized government was a complete failure. The author saw huge piles of fish rotting on a Pacific dock because somebody in the bureaucracy forgot to provide for the marketing of the fish. He described coal miners who emerged from the coal mines covered with coal dust, had to take showers without soap because someone in the bureaucracy forgot to provide soap to that area of the country. The attempt to control the economy from a centralized government led to a collapse of the economy. In contrast, an economy flourishes when the market prevails. People express their differences in people express their preferences in hundreds of millions of transactions in which price signals tell producers what they should be producing. And we have no experiences like they had in the Soviet Union where they tried to control things separately. I spoke about this as superintendent of schools because I thought it illustrated why No Child Left Behind was doing more harm to education than good. The attempt to control education from the center simply does not work in a continent-sized country. At a seminar, I met a congressional staffer who played a large role in writing No Child Left Behind. I was amazed at his ignorance of education. He just happened to be in the right place at the right time to sit down and write the rules that millions of teachers and students had to follow. A frightening tendency in our country is that younger people have a more favorable view of socialism than of capitalism. And last night I just read an article that said that a majority of Democrats now have a favorable view of socialism. This illustrates the toxic effect of our universities and of our students' utter ignorance of history. When I talk with someone about socialism, I point out that the last half of the 20th century provided a perfect experiment comparing the two systems of economy. In Germany and in Korea, the countries were divided in two, one of which was communist and the other which was capitalist. It was the same people, same culture, same work ethic. But West Germany greatly exceeded East Germany in what they produced. And in Korea, if you compare gross national product per person, South Korea exceeds North Korea by an unbelievable 100 to 1. Sometimes, even conservative elected officials forget about the importance of free enterprise. When I was in the legislature, Jeff Grosskopf was a very conservative Speaker of the House. He introduced a bill to stop banks from charging people for the use of ATM machines. So I went to him and I said, Jeff, that ATM machine belongs to the bank. We have no business telling them whether they can charge for it or not. If you don't want to pay a fee for the ATM machine, don't use the bank's ATM machine. Jeff said, yeah, but I have a constituent who doesn't like paying for the use of the ATM machine. One more example from the legislature. There was a movie showing what happens in eastern states when charter schools are limited by legislation. They were so oversubscribed that they held lotteries. Everyone would get a number, and they would pick out in a big ceremony. The gymnasium's full of people. I see people nodding who've seen the movie. The vast majority of parents and students who desperately wanted a charter school to get a better education were disappointed when their numbers didn't come up. It was heartbreaking. When I was in the legislature in the 1990s, the state Senate placed a provision in the Education Omnibus Bill to limit the number of charter schools. I was the chairman of the conference committee to reconcile the House and Senate versions. I killed that limitation provision. I thought there should be as many charter schools as the market, the parents and the students, wanted. As a result, Arizona's percentage of students in charter schools was first in the country when I left office, way ahead of Florida, which was second in the country. How many of you have you ever used Uber or Lyft? Raise your hand if you ever used Uber or Lyft. When I was Attorney General, there was a proposal to regulate them out of business. It was endorsed by everyone in my department, from the line lawyer to the chief deputy. I killed it. They said, what if the driver's not insured, as is required of taxi drivers? I said, people can decide for themselves if they want to use the service and take the remote risk that something negative will happen to them because the driver isn't insured. So I killed it, we didn't regulate it, and you guys can thank me for your ability to use Uber and Lyft. As you can tell, when I give speeches, I like to talk about big ideas. But my friends and supporters, including Lyle Rapaki over here, have told me that people want to know more about me. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. First, my background. My parents were Jewish people living in Warsaw, Poland in the 1930s. My father predicted that Hitler would invade and that they had to get out of there. He didn't have much formal education, but he loved to read history. And because he loved to read history, he was a very good interpreter of current events. And he predicted that Hitler would invade Poland in September of 1938. The actual invasion was September of 1939. He was off a year, but he got the month right because he knew from history that usually invasions take place after the harvest is in. He told his family and friends to leave, but nobody wanted to. My older sister was already born in Poland, and my mother didn't want to leave with a small child. But in those days, husbands had more authority over their wives than they do now, and he made her leave. All of those family and friends who would not listen, including my father's mother and 11 siblings, were killed in the Holocaust. My immediate family went to Canada in 1938 until they could come to the United States legally in 1949. In my role in education, I always emphasized the importance of teaching history. My father's knowledge of history, and therefore his ability to interpret current events, is the reason that my immediate family survived. I believe that the survival of the younger generation depends on their knowledge of history and their ability to interpret current events. My career has been a mixture of being a courtroom lawyer and public service. I have served in every one of 4 branches of government. You guys thought there were only 3. But the 4th branch of government is local government. I spent 24 years on my local school board, which is the 4th largest school district in the state. I was 10 years as its president. I was on the legislative branch. I was in the legislature, judicial branch. I was a judge pro tem in the Superior Court and the Court of Appeals. And executive, I was elected state superintendent of schools and attorney general. I'll give you an example of something I did as attorney general. Under my predecessor, the Attorney General's office were 4 years behind in prosecuting frauds and were turning down good cases. The roadblock was the investigators. I considered fighting fraud as one of my prime responsibilities because of the tragedy of people losing their life savings and some people losing millions of dollars. My predecessor did not have a good relationship with the legislature, and he had directed a disproportionate amount of the budget cuts to the investigators. There were too few, and their salaries were so low that there was a huge turnover. I needed to correct that. As a source of funds, I looked to our collections department, which received 1/3 of what they collected for the state on such things as unpaid taxes, and that goes into the Attorney General's budget. I went to the legislature, with whom I had a better relationship, and persuaded them to lift the limit on the 1/3 that our office could keep. I told them if they would lift the limit, they would get 2/3. That would be good for everybody. They agreed. Then I met with the collectors. The leadership style of their leader at the time had been to call people into his office and yell at them. I believe in positive leadership. Thank you. I believe in positive leadership. I replaced him. I gave the collectors a raise, and in a meeting I told them if they met my goals, they would get another raise and a major bonus. We increased collections from $6 million a year to $16 million a year. I was able to increase greatly the number of investigators and raise their salaries by 40%. I have a nice plaque from the Fraternal Order of Police for that one, and increase their numbers. I was also able to shore up other parts of the office, such as fighting the drug cartels. Overall, I have won 14 elections and lost 2. The last one I lost was for an election as Attorney General. The answer as to why I lost is right here in Yavapai County. The Yavapai County attorney brought a false charge against me of allegedly having coordinated with an independent campaign. That is contrary to elections law, but it was a false charge. The case went to an administrative law judge who ruled in my favor, but your county attorney could not accept the loss. As the prosecutor, she purported to overrule the administrative law judge. that's a practice that works great in totalitarian countries. You know, in the Soviet Union, if the prosecutor says you're guilty, you're guilty. It doesn't matter what a judge would say. But in our system, that doesn't go. That's contrary to our Constitution. So after I lost the election as a result of that false charge, we appealed. The Arizona Supreme Court reversed the Yavapai County attorney. The Arizona Supreme Court stated, specifically, we hold that when Polk assumed an advocacy role during the administrative law judge proceedings, the due process guarantee prohibited her from then serving as the final adjudicator. The Supreme Court overruled her but did not decide the merits. They sent the case to the Attorney General, and he in turn sent it to the Cochise County attorney to determine the merits of whether or not I had violated the campaign finance law. The Cochise County attorney read the entire record and found in my favor exactly as the administrative law judge had. He stated, he refers to here an FBI agent, the Yavapai County attorney had as a main witness an FBI agent. The FBI's inaccurate and misleading summary of the conversation with Mr. Tatham was a witness who the FBI agent said had said something, but Tatham recorded the call and proved that the FBI agent was lying. And then the FBI agent came back and said, oh, it was a later phone call. So the witness came back and showed his phone records that there was no later phone call. And subsequent inaccurate testimony regarding the same calls into question the reliability of other hearsay statements offered. The record, unfortunately, supports a conclusion that the investigation being conducted was not a search for the truth, but rather only intended to shore up conclusions already drawn. So I was vindicated, but it was unfortunately after the election had occurred. My next step was to sue the Yavapai County attorney for violating my constitutional rights. She moved to dismiss on the grounds that as a government official, she was entitled to immunity from lawsuits for decisions she made in good faith as a government official. The federal district court rejected that claim. The federal district court stated, the defendant's participation as both a prosecutor and judicatory authority for the administrative action is the exact opposite of the fairness, independence, and impartiality becoming of a judicial or quasi-judicial officer. The court finds that a reasonable official in the defendant's position, a position that is with legal training and advocacy, should have reasonably understood that serving as both a prosecutor and a final adjudicator for the same case would violate a defending party's due process rights. The defendant had to have known that it was improper for her to reverse the administrative judge's decision for a matter in which she was deeply involved as an advocate and prosecutor. Due process rights are among the earliest and most basic legal concepts attributable to the study of criminal and constitutional law, and the defendant should have understood that her participation in overruling the administrative judge's decision was improper. Now my lawsuit is at the Ninth Circuit for the determination of a technical question regarding of the statute of limitations. But if they rule my way, it's already been decided by the Arizona Supreme Court that she violated my constitutional rights, and it's already been decided by the final decider, the Cochise County attorney, that the charge she brought was false. Before I conclude, I just want to introduce Lyle Rapaki, who drove me around in my last campaign, has been a wonderful supporter, and Carmen Chenal, my fiancée, who's also a very fine lawyer. I'm now back in private practice. If you ever need to sue someone, give me a call. I'm your guy. Thank you. Yes.
What do you think County Attorney Sheila Polk's motivation was in demanding that you were overriding the adjudication aspect?
Right. I don't know exactly what it was, but I know it was political because when we tried to settle the case, she said she would only settle if I agreed never to run for office again. And I was not agreeable to doing that.
Wow.
Who pays all these court charges that the county attorney has, all these suits that she's filed against you? What happens there? Who pays the bill?
Well, I guess it's everybody here.
Nice.
Yes.
Do you know about how much it's been so far and what it possibly could be?
I don't know. I don't know. You had your hand up, I think?
I just wanted, it wasn't a question, I just wanted to share with you a conversation I had with her.
Go ahead.
I had sent her an email 2 times, and I said, tell me what your position is on red flag. She never answered me.
Your position on?
On red flag law.
Okay.
And I never heard from her. And I gave her plenty of time. Then I saw her, and then I asked her, and she was extremely hostile to me. I've never had a politician be hostile to me like that. She said, I know who you are. You're working for the David Stringer campaign, and that's why I didn't answer your question. I said, first of all, I'm not working for his campaign or anybody's campaign, and that shouldn't make any difference. Why would you not answer me? Well, okay, I'm for the red flag law. And then she goes on telling me her accomplishments. So I know she's lying. I mean, what kind of politician does this?
Well, if you do want to work for the David Stringer campaign, he's right behind you.
Yes, I know who David is.
Yes.
I'm in a taxpayer advocacy group, and we've been having a hell of a time with the fire districts that are up here and the way they consolidate, and they've been raising taxes and transferring money. We've gone to the Attorney General, and we cannot get any action out of him to help us. Is there anything we can do to try and further get investigation? But it seems like government does not like to investigate government.
Well, I didn't mind, and there'll be a new Attorney General in a couple of years.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, so on that front, are you considering, or would you ever consider coming back in? I know a lot of people here are very enamored. I'm very enamored with the work that you did as Attorney General. As Jim said, we got nothing but actions done, facts done, and every time I saw you in the campaign, while Mark talked about his hair and all the people who liked him and all the rest of that sort of business, for you it was facts. These are the cases that we've done, these are the actions that we've done. This is when I went to the US Supreme Court, this is when I went to the state of Arizona Supreme Court. It was all fact-oriented and what you had done in your job, representing us, the people. And so, any desire or designs to return in either for that office or another office?
Right now, I'm enjoying a private practice of law. The next election for Attorney General or other statewide offices will be after this election 2 years later, so I still have some time to make a decision. My mind is open.
Okay.
David.
Mr. Attorney General, you alluded to the case that is, I think, now before the Ninth Circuit on a somewhat technical issue relating to statute of limitations.
Yeah.
If the court rules in your favor, what are the implications for that for the county, for the local taxpayers, for Ms. Polk personally in terms of damages? And is there even a ballpark number that you can suggest?
Yeah, no, I would hesitate to do that, but I will say that at least if the Ninth Circuit rules in our favor on this technical issue, statute of limitations, then the fact that she violated my constitutional rights has already been decided by the Arizona Supreme Court. The fact that she brought a false charge has already been decided by the Cochise County attorney. So I think the only thing left would be damages, probably.
And who would pay those damages?
Well, we talked about that earlier. Yeah.
At the risk of having stuff thrown at me, I'd like to run this by you. I've made the attempt through the President's Secretary of Education that the quickest way to change the attitudes that have been percolating through schools and colleges about the way this country is founded and so forth, that they use the federal strings of money going to public schools to require them to teach units
Right.
K through 12 in real American history, American economics, and a thorough study of the Constitution. And I got a letter back after resending it because I didn't get an answer. I got a letter back saying, thank you for your communication. Take it up with your Arizona Department of Education.
Well, you hit on my passion. There are a few things I'm as passionate about as I am about teaching real American history, not propagandized history. You know, when I was in school, teachers, they wouldn't even let you know what party they belonged to or what their ideas were. They were there to teach, to get us to think, to give all sides of a question. Now they openly propagandize. And as you know, I fought a war against a program in Tucson which they called ethnic studies, where they put different kids in different classrooms depending on what ethnicity they were, just like the Old South. And particularly the Raza studies. Raza means the race in Spanish. We're engaging in horrific reverse stereotyping that, you know, white people interrupt a lot. And, you know, it reminded me of head of City College who used to teach that white people are cold and African Americans are sun-warmed or something like that. You know, there's a lot of strange stereotyping going on. And I fought a war against them, and as superintendent of schools, I made a finding that they had to shut down. First, I wrote the bill that was passed by the legislature to say you cannot have a course in our public schools that stereotypes people, that causes hostility toward other groups, that advocates overthrowing the government. This course was openly advocating giving back what they call Aztlan to Mexico. Aztlan is California, Arizona, New Mexico, all the states that were taken away from Mexico in 1848. And then, as superintendent of schools, I found that they were in violation. They had to shut it down. And I was able to do that on my last day in office. So in the morning, I held a meeting with myself and announced that I was holding them to be in violation. In the afternoon, I went and I became sworn in as Attorney General, and then I was able to fight as Attorney General, and we shut them down. But since I left office, they're back. But I'm very passionate about what you're talking about. Yes.
Another, on conservatism and founding of the country, another really good book is The Miracle at Philadelphia. You probably read that. But more people are aware of that or not.
Are you talking about the one by Catherine Drinker Bowen?
Yes, yes.
Catherine Drinker, you guys are hitting all my passions. Catherine Drinker Bowen is one of my very favorite authors of all time. In addition to that book, she wrote a book on Cook, the great 17th century English jurist that we had to read in law school. But my favorite book by her is called Friends and Fiddlers, about chamber music, because I have a chamber music group that's met in my house every Sunday for the last 30 years or so. And that's the book I really recommend. It's a wonderful book. Yeah.
Sir, you spoke about Uber and Lyft and your work in keeping those things going. And you spoke about free market society and how that is essential. I believe that both the lack of regulation over the free market and free market society should be in place to promote these conservative efforts. But without deregulizing other players in that same industry, isn't that a little contradictory? So you have multiple providers who are playing the same game. You give them different rules to play by.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't mind deregulating the taxis, and but I think one of the problems that we have, and there's a long chapter on that in this book by George Will, and I really urge you guys to get this. It's a fabulous book. There's a long chapter on this about how people will pressure government to restrict competition. So, you know, my personal experience with this was some people, a group of African American women who were at the Phoenix Community College were wanting to get their license to become hairdressers. And they have all these elaborate requirements. All they wanted to do was braid people's hair and do their own thing, and they had to learn all these things that were completely useless. But the hairdressers are organized enough to get the government to require people to go through all this licensing in order to restrict competition. I would say, let anyone who wants to be a hairdresser, and if you don't like the haircut you get, go someplace else. You don't need government to do that. When I was in the legislature, I was the only member of the Judiciary Committee who was a lawyer, but who voted to let building managers kick people out who weren't paying their rent without going through a lawyer. Let them come to court and do it themselves. You don't need 3 years of law school to come in and say they're not paying their rent, they need to leave. I'm totally in favor of massive deregulation compared to what we have. I'm going to mention one more book, and I promise not to mention any others. But it's a book that that talked about development in the third world. And in Peru, if you wanted to open a business, it took a couple of years. You had to bribe all kinds of people and get 100 different pieces of paper. In Singapore, you get all your permits in 2 hours at one spot. And Singapore is one of the economic miracles of the world, and Peru is in dire poverty. And we used to be taught when I was in college, and I was a political theory major, they used to tell us that there was a theory, I'm trying to think who wrote it, but it was about the Protestant ethic and capitalism. And it never made much sense to me that religion and economic success were tied together. I think people of any religion, if you take off the excessive government regulation from them and you let them be entrepreneurial, they will be entrepreneurial. And it doesn't matter what their religion is or their ethnicity or their background or anything. The key is have a government that keeps the peace, that protects people's security, that enforces contracts, that enforces property rights, and any people, no matter who they are, will be entrepreneurial and they will have a flourishing economy. And a number of countries have proven that in the last 50 years. Yeah.
You mentioned the third world, and it's kind of funny how I grew up there. And since you're in education,
Where did you grow up?
I was born in Vietnam prior to the massive invasion.
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about education, and I know it's one of your great point there. And you know, I remember when I was growing up, we study extremely hard. And if you know Vietnam, I mean, there's literally no resources of anything. You're lucky to have a piece of paper and a fountain pen. But somehow when we got here, you know, by the time I was in 9th grade, I can do calculus better than most college freshmen. And so the question is, how did that happen? And I keep going back to my teacher with a big stick. You know, discipline is an awesome thing. And I like to see discipline coming back to it. So I'm not saying you should go to capital punishment for not doing your homework. but I could remember walking out of the classroom with bullet holes still outside of the building.
Yeah, actually.
That's how we learn, but...
When I was superintendent of schools, I used to say, I have the total solution for our education problems. All parents should raise their kids the way Asian parents raise their kids, and we'll solve the problems of education. Some of you may have read The Tiger Mother about raising the kids that way. But I'll tell you another story, which is somebody I knew who grew up in a very poor Jewish community in Morocco, and they had the same thing, you know, a mud hut for a classroom and all that. Every single one of those kids is now a doctor or a lawyer, has some kind of advanced degree, because the spirit of learning was in that school.
We've got just time for a couple more questions.
Okay.
We gotta wrap
Name
up.
of your book again, can you give me the name of the book?
This one, The Conservative Sensibility by George Will. It was just published this recently.
George Will, a Democrat?
No. No, he was never a Democrat.
Must have been a different George Will.
Right. Anybody else? If not, you've been a great audience. Thank you very much.
Raise the next statement.